This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the Industrial Revolution. Changes in power. Traditional societies had been dependent on the biological order. The biological order refers to the time period in which patterns of natural development of life were led through things like agriculture, wind, water, and disease. Humans lacked the ability to control nature because of these patterns of dependency until the 1800s. That change came with two new sources of power, that of coal and steam. These forms of power switched human dependence on nature to human control over nature. Changes in technological power. Water could be turned into steam to provide pressure to move machines. Coal was used to heat the water to create this steam for the pressure that was needed. This allowed for the creation of new technologies like James Hargreaves' spinning jenny for the production of clothing and textiles, and Richard Trevithick's creation of the railroad. Why Britain first? One of the big questions in history is why Britain was the first country to industrialize. The Industrial Revolution had begun in Britain and then eventually was passed off to France and Prussia. The reasons that most historians think as to why Britain may have been the first country to develop so quickly was the following. First of all, they had stronger political stability. The reason for this was that the continent of Europe at the time was plagued by revolutions. First there was the initial French Revolution and then multiple ones after that. Also Germany went through its own democratic revolution. Britain also had a large deposit of coal in the northern area, which was a power source that was absolutely necessary for the Industrial Revolution. Britain was also a small island. That meant that it could easily connect up the entire island with a national railroad system. Changes to economic production. Industrialization changed the traditional cottage industry. Cottage industry referred to when a single person would produce a product in the home. They would then do something called the putting out system, in which an investor would provide funds to the individual to put out a product onto the market. The problem with this system was you could only make one product about per month, whereas under the Industrial Revolution, you could mass produce. In mass production, industrialization emphasized the ability to make multiple products and therefore lower the price over time. Changes to social structure. Traditionally, British landholders had allowed for the poor to squat on the land. Peasants and landowners would have sort of a mutually beneficial relationship. The landholders would allow the peasants to come onto the land, and the peasants would in essence clean up the land of its extra products. This would benefit the peasants, who could then eat, but it would also benefit the rich landowners who would then have land that was ready for new types of products. However, with the Industrial Revolution and mass production, peasants were actually getting in the way. At this point, landowners wanted to use every inch of land to mass produce agricultural products. This led to the enclosure movement, in which landholders kicked these peasants off the land in order to use it to mass produce agricultural goods. The effect was a massive migration movement of peasants into major cities like London. City life. As peasants moved into these cities, there were a number of problems that arose. Absolute standards of living did rise in comparison to where peasants were coming from out on the agricultural field, and this was because they could find jobs in the cities that paid higher than farming. However, wealthier owners were about 5% of society and ended up controlling about 30 to 40% of the wealth. This did have a positive benefit that not only did you see wealthy owners arise, like the middle class, which blossomed, including small owners, traders, and manufacturers, but with a huge amount of poor people entering into the cities, you also saw the growth of a poorer class of workers having a hard time finding jobs. The city life for the working class. The working class made up about 80% of society. Their working hours were about 16 to 18 hours per day for about 6 to 7 days a week. Men were paid about $6 on the week. Women were paid half of that at $3, and children were paid half of that for women at $1.50 per week. Children usually started to work at the age of about 8 years old. Social movements, Part 1. Some political leaders looked to potential reforms that would fix the economic problems but keep industrialization as it was. For example, the Chartist movement, which called for more voting rights for the entire male population, not just those males who own land. The Factory Act ended child labor in mines. Minimum wage legislation demanded a floor of basic wages that would allow for people to get out of poverty while also demanding more products. Maximum hours legislation demanded that workers only work between 8 to 12 hours per day. Social movements, Part 2. Other more radical movements argued that the primary problem of industrialization was not that it needed to be fixed, but rather the primary problem was economic competition itself. For example, Luddites argued that the industrial machines had robbed workers of their individuality. Socialists argued that economic inequality made workers into wage slaves to owners. In this type of a belief system, any fixing of the system would just create new problems, since the owners would always try to find a way to use workers as their slaves in order to create more economic profit. So only government intervention could be used to lower inequality. Marxism was the most radical of these movements, because it argued that the workers had to start a violent revolution to force the government to create a whole new system in which private property would be abolished and would eventually create social, economic, and political equality. Malthus. Malthus was a scientist and philosopher of the time period who warned of a far greater problem related to population growth. In his mind, industrialization had created a massive food surplus. The obvious positive of this is that more people could be fed. However, this would lead to a massive growth in population. He argued that while population would increase geometrically, the food supply would only increase arithmetically. This means that population would outstrip food supply very quickly, and he warned that this would lead to wars and famines followed by global chaos. The only solution in his mind was to force a limitation of births. Global competitors. Industrialization created the need for nation-states to compete for new forms of manufacturing and raw resources. France, Britain, Russia, and Prussia all began to organize their countries for industrial competition. This began with the creating of a national transportation system with railroads. Then the government would guide the growth of industry. The government would then create policies to ease the conflict between workers and owners. But the eventual goal here was for all of these countries to compete against one another in order to grow their economic wealth and then their leverage of power in the international marketplace. Prussia. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck instigated 2 wars with Denmark and France. This created fear in southern Prussia, who then joined with northern Prussia for defense, and this created Germany. Bismarck then used industry as a way to create unity and economic growth. He created the Zollverein. The Zollverein was a free trade zone in Central Europe that excluded Great Britain. The purpose of doing this was to put Germany into the leadership of Central Europe and to hopefully over time replace Britain's industrial power. The United States. Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves during the Civil War. Now, when Abraham Lincoln did this in 1863, he really did view his role as creating a moral crusade against the system of slavery itself. However, slavery and industrialization have a very strange relationship. You cannot have slavery in the Industrial Revolution. Why not? Well, in the Industrial Revolution, companies compete against each other. This means there will always be winning companies and losing companies. If an owner holds people as slaves, who are his workers, then once a company fails, he can't just let those slaves go. If he does, he loses his only remaining asset. However, in the Industrial Revolution, if workers are not slaves and a company fails, they can simply move to a new company. That means the Industrial Revolution does not work with slavery. So when the Civil War was all done, Abraham Lincoln was able to create, in a society that no longer had slaves, a strong industrialized system. He provided, for example, land grants to the railroads to build a transcontinental system. He provided land grants to colleges to provide for industrial education. He provided land grants to immigrants to move out west and populate North America. Now you might think, well, if he's allowing all these immigrants to go out west, they had become farmers. So what does this have anything to do with industrialization? But notice what he's doing. By creating a railroad system that connects up the entire continent and then moving people out west, he was creating the ability for cities to grow. True, the first generation of immigrants would be farmers, but their children and their grandchildren would be attracted to these cities, which would grow industrialization across the country. Abraham Lincoln's eventual vision was to have a national economy connected to the industrial core on the Northeast and in Pennsylvania. Russia. Russia's greatest obstacle to industrialization was its dependency of nobles on serfs. The nobles did not want to get rid of free labor by serfs, but this kept Russia backwards in agricultural. Peter the Great attempted to free the serfs, but the nobles rebelled after his death. Catherine the Great tried again to free the serfs, but again was stopped by the power of the nobles. Only the end of serf ties to the land would allow for the development of cities. And this did eventually come after the Crimean War in 1863. Yet even when serfs were freed in Russia after 1863, the nobles won a huge battle by forcing serfs to have to pay for their freedom. This eventually made serfs dependent upon the nobles even when they were no longer technically serfs. And this leads us up to the Communist Revolution in Russia. Latin America. Porfirio Diaz in Latin America represented the liberal reformers who wanted industrialization. However, Latin American countries formed single cash crop economies. Countries would provide a single item for consumption to North America. For example, Bolivia did tin, Cuba produced sugar, Argentina beef, and Ecuador cocoa. The problem with this is that the North and South became a relationship of dependency, in which South America relied upon the North to buy. And the problem with that, as we've talked about before in class, is that a dependency relationship based upon a single cash crop does not allow for the diversity that you need to develop industrialization. The Crimean War. The fight over the Balkans would change the dynamics of all of these countries. The Ottoman Empire still controlled the warm water ports of the Mediterranean and the Dardanelles Straits. Russia claimed this area for economic dominance due to its cultural relationship of the region and based on its Orthodox religion. France and Britain did not want Russia to gain all of this control, so because of that, they eventually got into a huge war in the Crimean region. Russia, because it did not let go of its serfs and did not industrialize, was nowhere near in power and strength as that of France and Britain, so it lost this war, and afterwards Russia realized it would have to industrialize. The problem is Russia was not able to get rid of serfdom, as we talked about before, and eventually that meant that Russia remained a backwards traditional agricultural country, and that leads us up to the Communist Revolution in Russia. Crimean War II. Greece and Serbia broke away from the Ottoman Empire in independence. Russia came to their aid, but were really after the Anatolian Peninsula. France and Britain went to war with Russia over this region. France and British industrial navies and armies massacred the Russians, which was still only relying upon horse and cart. The Crimean Impacts. The Russian loss led to massive changes in Russia as the Tsar ended serfdom and forced industrialization. Western Europe moved ahead with new forms of industry. For example, they developed the assembly line, an emphasis on specialized labor to produce mass amounts of products. Edison produced the use of electricity for energy and power. This helped to open up factories later and later into the night, providing for more and more mass production. The telephone took over for the telegraph for increased national communication. And the development of the combustible engine began to change the dynamics of transportation, away from that of the train towards things like the car. Foreshadowing the great conflicts. Number 1. The competition for raw resources in order to power industrialization will mean more intense competition for colonies in Africa and Asia. Number 2. America and Europe will come to dominate as they compete with each other and against the third world countries. Number 3. The global economy will become more interlinked as the first world produces and the third world became both the supplier of resources and consumers. This, of course, leads up to the big wars, especially World War I.